Princess Lyra stood at the window of her royal chambers, watching the 3 moons of her homeworld rise over the crystal spires of the capital city. Her 4 hands gripped the windowsill as she tried to control the ripple of colors flowing across her scales, a physical manifestation of her emotions that she could never fully hide. "Your Highness, the council awaits," said a servant from the doorway, careful to keep his eyes lowered. Lyra turned, her scales settling into a dull blue. "Thank you, Mev. I will join them shortly." The servant bowed and left quickly. Lyra knew why. No one wanted to spend more time than necessary with the flawed princess. Born as the firstborn child to Emperor Dorn of the Cutheri Empire, Lyra should have been celebrated. Instead, her birth had caused shock and whispers throughout the royal court. Unlike other Cutheri who had 2 arms and scales that remained a constant silvery hue, Lyra had emerged with 4 arms and scales that shifted colors with her feelings. In a society that prized genetic purity and conformity, she was seen as a mistake. A mutation, the court doctors had declared, a throwback to primitive times. Emperor Dorn had not rejected her outright. She was still his daughter, but he kept her away from public events. As she grew older, Lyra learned to stay in the shadows, to speak only when spoken to, and to cover her extra arms with special robes. Today was different. Today she could no longer hide. Lyra straightened her ceremonial robes and placed the royal circlet on her head. At 20 cycles old, she had reached the age when her training as heir to the throne should officially begin. By law, this required approval from the High Council. She walked through the long corridors of the palace, feeling the stares of courtiers and servants. Her scales flickered between deep blue anxiety and flashes of red determination. The doors to the Grand Council chamber swung open. 12 ancient Cutheri sat in a semicircle, their silver scales dull with age. At the center was her father, Emperor Dorn, his expression unreadable. "Princess Lyra, approach," called the head counselor. She moved forward, keeping her chin high despite the disapproving murmurs. "We have reviewed your claim to the position of crown heir," the head counselor said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "It is the finding of this council that your genetic anomalies make you unsuitable for the throne." Though she had expected this, the words still stung. Her scales flashed a bright yellow of pain before she could control them. "Father," she said, looking directly at the emperor, "I ask for the chance to prove my worth." Emperor Dorn shifted uncomfortably. "The council's decision is final, Lyra." "Then what is to become of me?" she asked. The council members exchanged glances. Her father cleared his throat. "The humans have requested a Cutheri representative for their new interspecies diplomatic program on Earth. You will go as our envoy." Lyra understood immediately. This was exile disguised as honor. Send the embarrassing princess far away where she could not shame the royal family. But as she stood there, feeling their rejection wash over her, a strange feeling bloomed inside her chest. Her scales shimmered with a new color, a vibrant purple that none in the room had seen before. It was hope. "I accept this mission," she said firmly. "I will represent our people with honor." As she left the chamber, Lyra realized something important. For the first time in her life, she was going somewhere new, somewhere where perhaps being different would not make her wrong. The stars beyond Cuthar beckoned, and among them, on a distant blue planet called Earth, her destiny awaited. The journey to Earth took 28 days aboard the Cutheri diplomatic vessel Starseeker. For Princess Lyra, each day brought a mixture of fear and excitement. She had never left her homeworld before. Now she was traveling across the stars to represent the very people who had rejected her. "We will arrive at Earth's orbital station in 6 hours, Your Highness," Captain Rel informed her as he entered her private quarters. Unlike most Cutheri, the captain treated her with respect, though his eyes still occasionally darted to her 4 arms. "Thank you, Captain," Lyra replied, her scales shifting to a soft green of anticipation. "Are the other ambassadors prepared?" The captain nodded. "Yes. Though I should inform you that Ambassador Cole has requested separate transport to the surface. Lyra's scales flashed orange briefly. Cole was from a noble house and had made no secret of his disgust at traveling with the four-armed aberration. His request was just another reminder that she would find no allies among her own kind. "I understand," she said quietly. "Please grant his request." After the captain left, Lyra turned to look at the approaching Earth through her viewport. The blue planet grew larger with each passing hour. Unlike the crystal deserts of Cuthar, Earth was covered in water and green landmasses. It looked so alive, so different from anything she had known. "Computer, display information about Earth's diplomatic compound," she commanded. A holographic display appeared before her, showing images of New Geneva, the international city built specifically for interspecies diplomacy after humans made first contact with alien civilizations 10 years ago. Lyra studied the faces of other alien representatives already stationed there. 12 different species had established relations with Earth. Would any of them accept her? Or would they, like her own people, see only her differences? The ship docked at Earth's orbital station with a gentle bump. Lyra gathered her courage and her few possessions. As princess, she had been given little time to prepare for this honor of representing Cuthar. Her father had barely spoken to her before her departure. "Remember your duty," he had said stiffly at their final meeting. "Do not embarrass our people." Those cold words still echoed in her mind as she stepped onto the station. A group of humans waited to greet her, dressed in formal diplomatic uniforms. "Princess Lyra of the Cuthari Empire, welcome to Earth Space Station Alpha," said a tall human female with dark skin and hair pulled back tightly. "I am Director Helen Wells of the Interspecies Diplomatic Corps. We're honored by your presence." Lyra bowed in the human style she had studied. "The honor is mine, Director Wells." The humans showed no obvious reaction to her four arms or color-changing scales. Their diplomatic training was excellent. But Lyra had learned to notice the subtle signs of discomfort, the slightly too wide smiles, the careful distance they maintained. During the shuttle ride to the surface, Director Wells briefed her on the upcoming diplomatic schedule. "The welcoming ceremony will be tomorrow. Representatives from all 12 allied species will attend, along with human dignitaries. Then you'll have orientation for 3 days before official meetings begin." Lyra nodded, her scales shifting to a thoughtful blue. "Will there be opportunities to learn more about human culture?" "My mission includes cultural exchange." "Of course," Director Wells smiled. "We have assigned a cultural liaison to each ambassador. Yours will meet you tomorrow after the ceremony." As the shuttle broke through Earth's atmosphere, Lyra caught her first real view of New Geneva. The city sparkled below, buildings of glass and metal arranged in perfect harmony with parks and waterways. It was beautiful, alien, and intimidating. The shuttle landed smoothly on a pad near a sleek building marked with the Cuthari Empire's symbol. "Your embassy," Director Wells explained. "Your staff arrived last week to prepare for your arrival." Lyra stepped out into Earth's air for the first time. It felt cool and heavy with moisture. The gravity was slightly stronger than home. Everything felt different. "Welcome to Earth, Princess Lyra," said Director Wells. "We hope you'll find a place among us." Lyra's scales rippled with a cautious lavender hope. Perhaps here, far from the prejudices of her homeworld, she might finally discover where she belonged. The welcoming ceremony at New Geneva's Grand Hall was a display of Earth's commitment to interspecies cooperation. Flags and symbols from 13 worlds hung from the high ceiling. Dignitaries from every allied species stood in groups, talking quietly as they waited for the formal proceedings to begin. Princess Lyra entered the hall wearing traditional Cuthari royal attire, modified to accommodate her four arms. She had spent hours preparing, determined to represent her people with dignity despite their rejection. Her scales were carefully maintained at a calm blue-green, though maintaining this took constant effort. As she walked through the crowd, conversations paused. Eyes turned toward her, some curious, others wary. The Cuthari ambassador who had arrived before her Cole deliberately turned away when she approached. Princess Lyra greeted a tall, thin alien with translucent skin. "I am Ambassador Vex of the Losi Confederation. We have heard much about Ctheri customs." The pause was slight but noticeable. Lyra understood what remained unsaid. They had heard about Ctheri obsession with genetic purity and knew exactly why she had been sent here. "It is an honor to meet you, Ambassador," Lyra replied politely. Her upper right hand performed the traditional Losi greeting gesture, while her lower hands remained clasped before her. The Losi ambassador's eyes widened slightly at her knowledge of their customs, but they quickly excused themselves to speak with others. This pattern repeated throughout the morning. Each diplomatic exchange was polite but brief. No one was openly rude, but no one truly welcomed her either. Even representatives from species that had 4 or more limbs themselves seemed uncomfortable around her. Word of her status had clearly spread. During the formal ceremony, Lyra stood alone as Director Wells introduced each new ambassador. When her name was called, the applause was polite but restrained. "And now," Director Wells announced after all introductions were complete, "please enjoy refreshments while meeting your assigned cultural liaisons." Servers circulated with food and drinks suitable for each species' biology. Lyra accepted a glass of clear liquid that the server assured her was safe for Ctheri consumption. It tasted strange, but not unpleasant, sweeter than the water of her homeworld. She stood by a large window overlooking the city, watching as other ambassadors met their human liaisons. Everyone seemed to pair off quickly. Minutes passed, and Lyra remained alone. "They probably forgot to assign me someone," she thought, her scales briefly flashing a disappointed gray before she controlled them again. "Princess Lyra." A male voice spoke from behind her. "Sorry I'm late. Security was extra thorough today." She turned to see a human male in his late 20s. Unlike the other liaisons in their formal diplomatic attire, he wore a simple blue suit that seemed slightly rumpled. His brown hair was just a bit too long by human military standards, and he had a friendly, open face. "I'm Marcus Reed, your cultural liaison," he said, extending his hand. Then, seeing her hesitation, he quickly changed the gesture to a perfect Ctheri formal bow. "Though I guess you prefer this greeting, right?" Lyra's scales rippled with surprise. Few non-Ctheri bothered to learn their traditional greetings. "Either is acceptable," she replied, cautiously extending her upper right hand, as she had seen other humans do. Marcus shook it gently, smiling. "Great. Sorry again for being late. I got held up because I brought something for you." He reached into a bag slung over his shoulder and produced a small plant in a decorative pot. "It's an earth orchid. I thought it might help make your quarters feel more welcoming." Lyra stared at the delicate purple flower, then at Marcus. No one had given her a gift in years, certainly not on her first meeting. "Is this a diplomatic custom?" she asked carefully. Marcus laughed. "No, not really. Just seemed like a nice thing to do. You've come a long way from home." He looked directly into her eyes when he spoke, not at her 4 arms or her shifting scales. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Lyra felt seen as a person, not just an oddity. "Thank you," she said, her scales flickering briefly to a warm purple before she could control them. Marcus noticed but said nothing about the color change. Instead, he gestured toward the door. "Would you like a tour of New Geneva? There's a lot more to this place than just diplomatic functions." For the first time in months, Lyra smiled. "I would like that very much." The New Geneva Botanical Gardens stretched for acres under a massive glass dome. Inside, carefully controlled environments preserved plant species from Earth and 12 other worlds. For Princess Lyra, it quickly became her favorite place on this strange new planet. The garden keepers created this section specifically for Ctheri plants last year, Marcus explained as they walked along a path lined with crystal-like succulents from Lyra's homeworld. "They're struggling a bit with the luminous desert roses, though." Lyra bent to examine a wilting specimen, her 4 hands gently touching the soil and stem. They need more salt in the soil and less water, she explained. On Cuthar, they grow in the driest regions and pull moisture from the air rather than the ground. Marcus pulled out a small device and made a note. I'll pass that along to the botanical team. They'll appreciate the insight. It had been 3 weeks since their first meeting at the welcoming ceremony. While other cultural liaisons maintained strictly professional relationships with their assigned ambassadors, Marcus approached his role differently. He spent extra hours with Lyra, showing her not just the official diplomatic venues, but the small cafes, public parks, and cultural centers that made up the real heart of New Geneva. Why do you do this? Lyra asked as they sat on a bench overlooking a pond where earth fish swam in lazy circles. The other liaisons don't spend this much time with their ambassadors. Marcus considered her question. Honestly, because you're interesting to talk to, and because I think you're getting a raw deal. A raw deal. Lyra's translator struggled with the idiom. An unfair situation, Marcus clarified. I've researched Cuthari culture enough to understand why you're here instead of preparing to take the throne. And I think it's wrong. Lyra's scales darkened to a deep blue of sadness. My people value conformity above all else. I am not conforming. No, you're evolving, Marcus said firmly. Your differences aren't flaws. They're adaptations. Evolution in action. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched one of her hands. It was the first time anyone had willingly touched her since she was a child. Lyra's scales rippled with bright colors that no Cuthari had ever displayed before, swirls of gold and pink that reflected emotions she had no names for. Did I say something wrong? Marcus asked, noticing the dramatic color change. No, Lyra whispered. No one has ever suggested that I might be evolving. Only defective. Marcus frowned. Well, that's narrow-minded thinking. Look, I studied xenobiology before joining the diplomatic corps. Genetic variations happen for a reason in nature. They don't always stick, but sometimes they're exactly what a species needs to survive changing conditions. He pointed to the fish in the pond. See those gold ones? They're descended from fish that were once all silver. A genetic mutation made some gold. Humans thought they were beautiful, so they bred more of them. Now that variation is considered normal. Lyra watched the golden fish swimming among their silver cousins, but my variation happened without purpose. Are you sure? Marcus asked. Has anyone actually studied why some Cuthari are born with 4 arms or color-changing scales? Or did they just decide it was bad because it was different? The question struck Lyra silent. In all her years, no one had suggested researching her condition beyond classifying it as a mutation to be hidden. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe we should find out, Marcus suggested. The diplomatic compound has excellent research facilities. With your permission, we could have human geneticists study Cuthari DNA samples, including yours. My father would never approve, Lyra said, her scales shifting to an anxious yellow. Marcus smiled. You're the Cuthari ambassador to Earth. You don't need his permission to engage in scientific cooperation. It falls within your diplomatic authority. For the first time, Lyra realized the freedom her exile had given her. Here, thousands of light years from Cuthar, she could make her own choices. Yes, she said, her scales settling into a determined green. Let's find out the truth. As they left the garden, neither noticed the Cuthari aide watching from the shadows, recording everything to send back to Ambassador Cole, and through him, to the royal court on Cuthar. Prince Tarn paced the private chamber within the Cuthari royal palace, his silver scales gleaming in the light of 3 moons that streamed through the crystal windows. Before him stood Ambassador Cole, recently returned from Earth with troubling news. You are certain of this? Tarn demanded, his thin fingers clenching into fists. My sister is conducting genetic research with the humans. Cole bowed low. Yes, my prince. My aide witnessed it himself. Princess Lyra has provided DNA samples to human scientists, and they are studying the genetic markers for her. abnormalities. Tarn hissed in frustration. He had thought sending Lyra to Earth would remove her from the succession completely. Instead, she might be finding answers that could threaten everything. "This cannot continue," he said. "The law is clear. Only those of pure genetic lineage may rule. If Lyra somehow proves her condition is not a defect, but a natural variation, then her claim to the throne remains valid," finished Lord Vex, the aging head of the royal council who had joined them in the chamber. "This is most unfortunate." On the table between them lay reports from Earth, images of Lyra walking freely among humans, using all four of her arms openly, her scales shifting through colors that revealed her emotions without shame. Worst of all were the pictures of her with the human male, Marcus Reed, who seemed to be helping her in ways far beyond his official duties. "We must act quickly," Tarn said. "Father grows weaker each day. If he dies before we resolve this situation, Lyra could return to claim the throne." Lord Vex nodded gravely. "The Emperor need not know the details. His health is too fragile for such concerns." "What do you propose, my prince?" Call asked. Tarn's eyes narrowed as a plan formed in his mind. "We will order Lyra to return immediately for a formal genetic examination. We'll claim it's a routine procedure required by law before her position as ambassador can be fully confirmed." "And when she arrives?" Lord Vex asked. "The examination will be conducted by doctors loyal to me," Tarn explained. "They will declare her condition a dangerous mutation that could spread to future generations. The council will have no choice but to permanently remove her from the line of succession." "And if she refuses to return?" Call asked. Tarn smiled coldly. "Then she defies a direct order from the throne. That alone is grounds for disqualification." The three conspirators failed to notice the small service drone hovering near the ceiling, recording every word. The drone belonged to Mev, Princess Lyra's former servant who still remained loyal to her despite her absence. Meanwhile, on Earth, Lyra and Marcus sat in the research lab of Dr. Eleanor Park, one of Earth's leading xenogeneticists. The doctor's face was serious as she displayed complex genetic maps on the large screen before them. "I've compared your DNA with the standard Q theragenome on file," Dr. Park explained. "The results are fascinating." The screen showed twisting strands of genetic code, with several sections highlighted in bright colors. "The genes controlling your additional arms and color-changing scales aren't new mutations at all," Dr. Park continued. "They're actually dormant genes that exist in all Qtheri, just inactive in most individuals." Lyra leaned forward, her scales pulsing with a deep purple of concentration. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not defective," Marcus said, excitement in his voice. "Your genetic pattern is part of the natural Qtheri genome. It's just that these genes are usually switched off." Dr. Park nodded. "Exactly. Something in your development activated these dormant genes. The question is why. In most species, dormant genes reactivate in response to environmental pressures or needs." Before Lyra could process this revelation, her communication device chimed urgently. The message was marked with the royal seal of Qthar. "By order of Emperor Dorn and the Royal Council, Princess Lyra is commanded to return to Qthar immediately for mandatory genetic examination." The timing couldn't be coincidence. Somehow, word of her research had reached home. As Lyra read the message, a second communication arrived, this one encrypted and marked only with the symbol of her childhood servant. "Mev, my princess, beware. Prince Tarn plans to declare you genetically unfit upon your return. Do not come home." Lyra's scales flashed with alarm, a bright red that made Marcus immediately move to her side. "What is it?" he asked with concern. "Trouble," Lyra answered simply. "They want me back on Qthar, and I think it's a trap." "You can't go back," Marcus said firmly as they hurried through the corridors of the Earth diplomatic headquarters. "If your brother has doctors ready to declare you unfit, it's clearly a setup." Princess Lyra moved quickly beside him, all four of her hands in constant motion. two holding data tablets, one clutching Mev's warning message, and the fourth absently touching the wall for balance as they rounded corners. Her scales flickered between anxious yellow and determined green. "If I don't return, I defy a direct royal command," she explained. "That alone gives them grounds to remove me from succession." They entered the small conference room Marcus had hastily reserved. Dr. Park was already waiting with additional genetic reports spread across the table. "I've been reviewing the historical Q-Theory genetic database you provided," Dr. Park said without preamble, "and I found something remarkable." She activated the room's holographic display, showing a timeline of Q-Theory history, with several points highlighted in bright colors. Throughout Q-Theory recorded history, there have been periodic appearances of individuals with your same traits, 4 arms and color-changing scales, Dr. Park explained. Most were hidden away or removed from society, but they appear consistently every few hundred years. Marcus studied the timeline closely. "There's a pattern here. These appearances seem to coincide with periods of environmental change on Cuthar." Dr. Park nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. 300 years ago, when Cuthar experienced that decade of unusual solar activity, there was a spike in 4-armed births, and again during the Great Dust Storms 800 years ago." Lyra's scales shifted to a deep blue of realization. "Our oldest legends speak of the many armed ones who saved our people during the time of darkness, when the suns dimmed and cold swept across our world." "Evolutionary adaptation," Marcus whispered. "Your body isn't defective. It's preparing for something." Lyra looked at her 4 hands, seeing them with new understanding. "The weather patterns on Cuthar have been changing over the last century. Temperatures rising, more violent dust storms. And your body is genetically adapted to handle those conditions better," Dr. Park finished. 4 arms for greater stability in high winds, color-changing scales that can adjust to different heat levels and radiation exposure. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Finally, Marcus spoke. "You need to go back," he said, surprising both women. "But the trap?" Lyra began. "We'll fail if we're prepared," Marcus interrupted. "This isn't just about your right to the throne anymore. This is about your people's future." He began pacing the room, his mind working rapidly. "We need to present this evidence not just to your father, but to all Cuthari. We need irrefutable proof that your differences aren't defects, but evolutionary advantages that could be crucial for survival." Dr. Park tapped her tablet. "I can compile a comprehensive genetic report with historical correlations, but will the Q-Theory scientists accept human research?" "Not alone," Lyra admitted. "But if we could get support from other species." Marcus snapped his fingers. "The Galactic Scientific Council. If we can get their endorsement, not even your brother could dispute the findings." For the next 3 days, they worked tirelessly. Dr. Park compiled the genetic research, while Marcus used his diplomatic connections to arrange emergency presentations to scientific representatives from 7 allied species. Lyra spent hours in communication with the few loyal supporters she still had on Cuthar, including Mev, who continued to send updates on Prince Tarn's plans. On the 4th day, Lyra stood before the assembled Galactic Scientific Council in the Grand Chamber. Representatives from 12 species listened as she presented the evidence of her genetic adaptation. "These traits that my people have labeled as defects are in fact naturally occurring adaptations that have appeared throughout our history during times of environmental stress," she explained, her scales a confident deep green. "The same environmental changes are occurring on Cuthar now." The council deliberated for only 2 hours before reaching their conclusion. Their verdict was unanimous. Princess Lyra's genetic variations represented natural adaptive evolution, not defects or dangerous mutations. Armed with the council's official endorsement and surrounded by scientific allies from 7 worlds, Lyra prepared to return to Cuthar. As she boarded the diplomatic vessel, Marcus stood at her side. "I'm coming with you," he said simply when she looked at him questioningly. "This won't be safe," she warned. "My brother won't give up easily." Marcus smiled. I know, but I chose you when no one else would. I'm not backing out now. Lyra's scales rippled with colors no Kutheri had ever displayed before, brilliant gold intermingled with deep rose. She didn't try to control them this time. Then let's go home, she said, and show my people their future. The royal palace of Kuthar gleamed under the light of 3 moons as Princess Lyra's ship descended through the atmosphere. Crystal towers caught the moonlight and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the desert landscape. Beautiful as it was, Lyra felt only tension as they approached. Ready? Marcus asked, standing beside her at the viewpoint. Lyra's scales rippled with a mixture of determination and anxiety, swirls of green and yellow. As ready as I'll ever be. The landing platform was crowded with royal guards in ceremonial armor. At the center stood Prince Tarn, flanked by Lord Vex and Ambassador Cole. Their faces were masks of formal politeness, but their eyes burned with anger. "Welcome home, sister," Prince Tarn said as Lyra descended the ship's ramp. His voice was cold despite his words. His eyes narrowed when he saw Marcus following behind her. "I see you've brought a guest. This is Marcus Reed, Earth's diplomatic representative," Lyra said formally. "And these are scientists from the Galactic Scientific Council." 7 alien scientists of different species emerged from the ship, each carrying official documentation. Tarn's face paled slightly. "The medical examination is a private royal matter," Lord Vex interjected quickly. "Outsiders cannot be present." "This is no longer just a royal matter," Lyra replied firmly. "This concerns the future of all Kutheri." Before Tarn could argue further, a commotion arose at the edge of the platform. Guards parted to reveal Emperor Dorn himself, moving slowly with the aid of a hovering support chair. His scales had dulled with age and illness, but his eyes remained sharp. "Father," Lyra and Tarn said in unison, both surprised by his presence. "I wish to see this matter resolved personally," the Emperor said. His voice was weaker than Lyra remembered, but still carried authority. "What is the meaning of these foreign scientists?" Lyra stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Father, I have discovered the truth about my condition. It is not a defect, but an evolutionary adaptation, one that has appeared throughout our history during times of environmental change." Tarn laughed dismissively. "Absurd claims from human scientists who know nothing of our biology." "Not just humans," said a tall, insectoid scientist stepping forward. "I am Professor Zik of the Arachnid Collective. Our genetic research confirms Princess Lyra's claim." One by one, each alien scientist presented their findings. The evidence was clear and overwhelming. Lyra's 4 arms and color-changing scales were adaptations to changing conditions on Kuthar, conditions that were becoming more extreme with each passing year. The Emperor listened silently, his expression unreadable. When the presentations finished, he turned to Lord Vex. "You told me my daughter's condition was a dangerous mutation that would weaken our bloodline," he said quietly. Lord Vex bowed, unable to meet the Emperor's gaze. "We believed it to be true, Your Majesty." "You believed what was convenient," Marcus said, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to him. "Princess Lyra's adaptation threatens those who fear change, but it may save your people in the coming environmental shifts." Murmurs spread through the gathered crowd. Many had never heard a human speak so boldly before their emperor. Emperor Dorn studied Marcus with interest. "You stand with my daughter when her own people rejected her. Why?" Marcus looked at Lyra, his eyes warm. "Because I saw her value when others could not. Because differences aren't always flaws. Sometimes they're exactly what we need to survive." The Emperor nodded slowly, then turned to face the crowd. His voice suddenly regained its strength as he announced, "The examination is complete. Princess Lyra's genetic adaptations are declared beneficial to the royal line and to all Kutheri." Tarn stepped forward in protest, but the Emperor raised his hand for silence. "Furthermore, I have seen today who truly has the wisdom to lead our people into an uncertain future. Prince Tarn, You conspired to remove your sister from succession through deception. You are hereby removed from the royal line." Gasps echoed across the platform. Tarn's face contorted with rage, but royal guards moved quickly to surround him. Emperor Dorn turned to Lyra, his expression softening. "My daughter, I fail to see your worth. I allowed ancient prejudices to blind me to your strength. Can you forgive an old man's mistake?" Lyra's scales shimmered with emotion, a beautiful cascade of blues and purples. "There is nothing to forgive, Father." In the days that followed, word spread throughout Cutheri space. The four-armed princess had returned, not as an outcast, but as the rightful heir. Scientific teams began studying the environmental changes affecting their homeworld and how Lyra's adaptations might help their species survive. And beside her through it all stood Marcus, the human who had chosen her when all others turned away, now officially appointed as Earth's ambassador to Cuthar, but unofficially much more. "What happens next?" he asked as they stood together on the palace balcony, watching the first sunrise. Lyra's scales rippled with hopeful gold as she took his hand in one of her four. "We build a new beginning. For all of us."